welcome everybody to the Forgiveness Forum, and this is Eileen Barker, and I want to just say I'm really excited about the call today. Our guest is Ralph Kilman, and we're really honored to have you, Ralph. I've known about Ralph's work, 20 years maybe. When I first started teaching, what I soon became aware of was that all of the classes of negotiation and mediation were giving the students something called the TKI, which is the Thomas-Kilmann instrument. And what it does, it's a self-assessment that shows you what your conflict mode is. And there were 5 modes that you were, I hope I get this, accommodator, competitor, collaborator, compromiser, or avoider. And those were the 5 basic styles. And then from there, we would have this rich discussion about what the styles were and how you can work with each one. Each one has pluses and minuses. It was really interesting. And it was one of the things we would do early on in the class, is just sort of a window into conflict itself and how different people operate. And so we could do a whole call just on that, but that is not really the topic. But the Thomas-Kilmann instrument, as it turns out, was developed by Ralph Kilman many, many years ago, and I recently became aware that Ralph was working on a book about conflict and forgiveness, so that I really perked up, of course, and got in touch with him, and became aware that he has, since developing that instrument, developed a whole body of work about conflict management and change management, and worked with a number of, leading corporations and universities. He does a lot of research and consulting, and just, it's really quite amazing, the breadth and depth of his work. And so he graciously agreed to come on to the Forgiveness Forum and talk to us today. And Ralph, I just couldn't be more excited to hear what you have to say and just have you be part of this forum. So thank you very much. And at this point, I'll turn it over to you. And when you're ready to open it up for questions and discussion, just let me know.
Thank you, Eileen, and thank you for your very kind words about my work. That's always nice to hear. It is a pleasure to be here. My only frustration is to have about 20 minutes to present what took 40 years to develop, but I will surely do the best I can. Let me begin with this perspective. Conflict, that is an example of what we call an interdisciplinary concept, a concept that can embrace and explain life on so many levels. So in terms of conflict, it can be conflict within you, all the way to conflict between nations. And then there's our other interdisciplinary concepts that I found very, very worthwhile, which I'll be touching upon in the next minutes. For example, boundaries. I have found that to be as rich as conflict in understanding what's going on at all levels of life. Boundaries that people have within themselves, and all the way up to the boundaries between nations, which they fight over all the time. And then there is the concept of truth. We've always talked about what is real, what is reality, what really happened, and whose story to believe. And truth is fascinating because it's often socially constructed. It's based on selective recall. It's made up. It's determined by a group. And then you may say, is there anything that's really true? Well, there might be a divine truth, and then there's everyone else's truth. But that's a topic that often comes up in any discussion. What is real? What really happened? Consciousness is another one of those embracing concepts. What stage of consciousness are people at? They can be very egocentric, and all they can see is themselves, and they can't even put themselves in other people's shoes. And then there are ethnocentric people who are able to identify with a group, but if you're not in their group, they don't have the same empathy for you. And through consciousness development, people can move up to what is called a world-centric or Theo-centric consciousness, where everything is a part of you, and you have empathy for all life, the planet itself, the entire universe. You'll see that in all discussions of relationships, mediation, coaching, counseling, consciousness is always hidden, if not the center of attention. And then we have the other additional concept called relationships, with yourself, with other people, and of course between nations. So there are so many of these concepts, and forgivingness to me is a part of this discussion, because forgivingness is a sign that some resolution or healing has taken place about people whose boundaries have been violated, who have been struggling to discuss what is true and what isn't, who argue to the death over being right about what really happened. And if they can't ultimately find forgiveness in themselves and others, which is often a case of forgiving themselves from having judged themselves, which is separate from the event, if those things don't happen, then true healing can't take place. I guess what I haven't mentioned is, well, we often talk about conflict resolution and conflict management. I have come to see it more as healing, which is another word of becoming whole. And I think our whole journey as human beings is to become whole. The problem is that we grow up in a family, mostly a dysfunctional family, and therefore we have struggles with mother, father, brother, sister, caretakers. Our boundaries get violated, and then later on in life we recreate those situations and we go to war. And that's what we often find in the courts and even in mediation, where people are still at war, not just for the present, but also from the past. So this is just a very brief overview of some of the important concepts beyond just conflict that allow us to see deeply what is really going on. Now let me start by saying something about boundaries, because unlike conflict, we don't hear a whole lot about that. In all my research, I have found that there are 5 basic boundaries that we need to be sensitive to, that everyone has a right to from day one. There's the physical boundary that surrounds your body and the space around you. There's the sexual boundary. There is the emotional boundary, what you feel. There's the mental boundary, what you believe. And the spiritual boundary, your beliefs in God or some order or intelligence that is beyond you, beyond what we call your skin-encapsulated ego. So we have this physical, sexual, emotional, mental, spiritual boundaries. And I have found that previous and present violations of those boundaries is what war, discord, argument, court scenes are all about. So the question in the whole forgiveness process for me has always been, can we recognize those boundary violations? How do you approach them? Can they be healed? And there are different ways of doing that. I developed a 9-stage process, and I'm going to briefly describe to you from beginning to end what that stage process is, and then I will open it up for a discussion, question and answer on any one of those stages that you'd like me to explore further, any questions you might have, or anything about those core interdisciplinary concepts, ones like boundaries, truth, consciousness, and so forth. Okay. Now, to begin, I actually labeled the first stage, stage 0, because it permeates all the stages. It is the foundation. It is the ground stage. And basically it is participating in mind, body, spirit modalities. Why? So we can engage and enhance our consciousness. That is the core. If people were at higher levels of consciousness, the whole discussion would be different. And it's not just about which approach you'll choose to negotiate in a mediation or in the court or between 2 people in any other situation. Consciousness also determines the tone. Do we have compassion? Do we compete? Can I empathize with your position, or can I only see my own? So I'm suggesting that our society, as well as individuals, have a responsibility to expand their mind, body, spirit consciousness, because it deals with all their relationships, past, present, and future, and how they discuss conflict and differences. Then step 1, or stage 1, after this foundation, is deciding to meet with another person who has violated your boundaries or has triggered boundaries that have been violated in the past. In fact, there's one thing about boundaries. I mentioned the 5, but there's also temporal boundaries, not just spatial boundaries. There's a boundary between the past and the present. And for people whose boundaries have been violated, that boundary between past and present often is very flimsy. And what that means is any unresolved conflict, any unresolved wounds from the past are bled into the future. And as a result, what you're dealing with in the present has more to do with never got resolved 20, 30 years ago than it does with the person who is sitting right in front of you. But deciding to meet takes some courage. It already takes a certain amount of consciousness to say, I want to resolve this. Sometimes it's by necessity. Sometimes it is mandated. Other times it's by choice. But basically, you're trying to resolve a relationship, which is also resolving the relationship with yourself. After you decide to meet, and incidentally, some resolutions can take place without a live meeting. Often I think as facilitators, as practitioners, we find ourselves with people who want to meet live, and that's why we do what we do. But it is very possible to resolve issues on your own without any engagement with the other person. But let's say you decided to meet. Stage 2 is then confronting the truth of each person's story. This is where that concept of truth comes in. And as I mentioned, it's my truth, my story, your story. Is there anything that's real? It's socially constructed, but the point is, so many times discussions break down because we haven't agreed on, did something happen? What happened? Who hurt whom? Why is there a breakup in the relationship? Is there a cause? Do we have different stories about this? In most cases, yes. There's a different story for every person. But until you can resolve and come up with a composite of this is what happened and how it happened, it's often very difficult to move on to subsequent stages and have true forgiveness. Otherwise, you get lip service. People say, well, I'll agree. I say I forgive you. But until I can appreciate that we have a shared version of truth, it's hard to move on in life and to heal those boundaries. And as I mentioned earlier, to me, it's all about healing and becoming whole. Call it what you will, at the individual level, at the group level, at the national level, and the international scene. It's all about healing and becoming whole. That's what the journey has always been. And as facilitators, practitioners, we try to facilitate and enhance that process. Stage 3 is negotiating a joint version of reality. Can we come to an agreement on what happened, if something happened, how it happened, what is the truth of why we're here? And this, in fact, is where I make use of that Tki Conflict Model that Eileen mentioned, except I've already taken the liberty of slightly changing some of the labels just because they fit better with negotiation of truth. So think about this. We are trying to negotiate truth. Now, one style is called maintaining. And maintaining is where you're simply going to maintain your version of reality and expect the other person to concede. You don't give any credence to the other person's story or experience. Of course, if you're at a lower stage of consciousness, if you are egocentric, it is virtually impossible. You can't put yourself in someone else's shoes. You can only wear your own shoes. So you maintain your truth and as if there's only one reality, your reality. At the other side is conceding, and that's where you acknowledge, yes, I hear what you're saying, and I have to agree that's the way it happened, and you basically say, I will abide by the other person's story and give up on my own. Sometimes perpetrators, out of guilt, they kind of hold on to their version of reality because it hurts too much to realize what they've done, if they have any self-empathy at all. But basically, for the resolution and the healing to take place, it often helps if the perpetrator concedes the victim's reality. And then sometimes in the middle you have what is called combining, or sometimes called compromising, where you say, well, this part of the story, let's go with my side, this part of the story with your side, can we agree to that? So you put some of the pieces together. It's not a true synthesis, but at least you're starting to understand you've each played a role in what happened, and you own up to your part of the story, the other person's part of the story. There's a combination there. The best you can do with negotiating truth is what I call synergizing, also called collaborating. And that is where you come up with a new shared reality. You realize that each of you has a very limited perspective based on selective memory, based on previous wounds, based on self-serving needs, ego needs, and through a breakthrough experience, and again, that takes a certain stage of consciousness, but if you are of that higher stage, then you're able to come up with a new reality that includes everything of your story, the other person's story, and more. That is the best way to ultimately have a healing of becoming whole, and you'll see in a little bit that's when forgivingness is authentic and lasting, and it's not just rhetoric. Stage 4 is then apologizing for having violated the other person's boundaries. Sometimes it's mutual. Both people have violated one another's boundaries. Sometimes it's one way, sometimes it's two way. But the apology is perhaps the first acknowledgement saying, okay, for the first time I can see that you've been hurt and I played a role in your hurt, because now I can accept that part of our truth is your version of reality that I now have to include in my version of truth and reality. Stage 5 is taking the steps to prevent further violations in the future. Now, in the case of a violation against the child may now be an adult. The adult can take appropriate action to safeguard their boundaries from further violations. Maybe the perpetrator, the other adult, might say, well, if I had to do it all over again, I would have done it differently. And that sometimes eases some of the pain. Or both adults simply say, from now on, this is how we're going to have a conversation, this is how we're going to talk to one another, and we're going to be sensitive not to violate those same boundaries again. Sometimes there's a reversal of stage 4 and 5, where it helps, I have found, for people to first indicate, these are the specific steps I will take to make sure I don't violate you this way again. And then an apology is more likely to be forthcoming. In fact, people often can go back and forth on these various stages. It's not meant to be a stepwise, lockstep progression. There's flexibility. So I'm just organizing it, but there can be flexibility here. Then as stage 6, I have called forgiving the other person and yourself, which of course brings us to the main focus of this forum. And the one thing I'd like to stress in this step, is I mentioned it briefly, is often the real issue is forgiving yourself for having judged yourself and having judged the other person, let alone what event took place. Judgment clouds everything, and we are often hard on ourselves, hard on other people, because we feel we've been judged as less than somebody else, which is a separate issue sometimes from the event that may have taken place or what brings people into combat. Also related to forgivingness, I have found, and this I've discovered quite recently, I have to look up what literature and what discussion has been on resentment. Why is there resentment sometimes? Which is an interesting word, and you might want to think about what is resentment in your life when certain people behave a certain way, maybe the person you're in conflict with, and you resent their behavior. What does that mean? Because resentment, I have found, makes it very difficult to forgive because there's an underlying negative energy of distaste, dislike, even to despise the other person, and that makes forgivingness very difficult. Whereas resentment usually comes from within you and has nothing to do with the other person. You might simply say, hey, the other person was acting out of a certain stage of consciousness. They were angry. They've been violated in the past. I can understand that. I don't have to resent it. When I resent someone else's behavior, it's harder to forgive myself as well as them. Stage 7 is mourning. Mourning what was lost. No matter who's involved in the dispute, the conflict, everyone's losing something because the conflict is draining energy, draining focus, clouding your mind, preventing you from doing other things you love to do. So you've lost something when you've been in conflict, especially when it's been under negative conditions, when there's some kind of battle going on, whether it's in the courtroom, whether it's mediation, or you're still battling yourself in a therapy session. But mourning what was lost. And then stage 8, which is actually it's number 8, but it's stage 9 simply because of the first one being 0, is moving forward in life. And the whole purpose of these 9 stages is to resolve relationships, because I have found the unresolved relationships from the past so often bleed into the present. The present makes it all worse, but it's not an isolated thing. And by resolving our primary relationships, mother, father, sister, brother, caretakers, school teachers, neighborhood friends, pets, whatever, you can be whole, and you can devote all your energy to living your life's purpose, your soul's purpose, your reason for being here. So I have come over these 40 years. It's been a long journey for me. And what I've ultimately found is that all these concepts that are discussed in the university and are applied by professionals, for me, are all about healing and becoming whole. And by keeping that in mind and fostering the consciousness that allows this process to unfold, this is what the journey is of our entire universe. That's my perspective. Okay, that's 20 minutes of 40 years of work. So now I'll be glad to entertain any comments, any questions you have about anything I've said.
Thank you, Ralph. Your comments are just so comprehensive in terms of really laying out some very deep truths about conflict and all the dynamics. So you've really given us a big swath here to look at. It's great. And I want to invite anybody who has a question now. You can raise your hand by pushing *2, and then we can unmute you. And the other thing is that there's a way, if you go to if you're on the website, you can submit a question in writing as well. And actually, there has been a question submitted, so why don't we start with that question? It says, how do you work with folks who are starting at different stages and need to resolve an issue? That's a great question. Where do you start? So
in terms of their stages of consciousness, I assume.
I would assume so, yeah. There are different levels.
An excellent book, and I've discussed this with Eileen in the past, is David Hawkins, Hawkins. He's an MD, PhD, and he wrote a book, Power versus Force. And in that, he has a model for the stages of human consciousness. And the lower stages are like shame, guilt, apathy, grief, fear, anger, pride. And just as you hear the sound of them, you can tell that would bring any conversation down. The higher stages of consciousness are courage, neutrality, willingness, acceptance, reason, love, joy, peace, compassion. They sound very different. What his whole argument is this stages of consciousness model is logarithmic, which means as you move up the scale, each step is tenfold beyond the one before it. And what this really means is if you have two people in conflict, all it takes is one person to be at a higher stage of consciousness, truly, not just rhetoric saying, oh, I'm evolved and I'm one with the universe. No, we're talking about to their core, they have evolved. Then they generate a kind of energy, a kind of environment, a setting where it becomes safe for the other person to be more vulnerable and begin talking about things perhaps they've never talked about before. If two people are at the lower stages of consciousness, they're going to be undoubtedly locked into an egocentric approach, unable to hear, respond to the other. Their need is to continue the battle because their inner selves are being battled all the time. So they're familiar with war. So whether it's inside me or between me or someone else, let the war proceed. It's very difficult to come to a higher level of healing under those conditions. All it takes is one. Two people don't have to be at a higher stage of consciousness to be able to sit down and then to resolve their issues. It just takes one. So, again, I think it's a responsibility. I would phrase it this way. It might even be an imperative that our society finds ways to expand the consciousness of its citizens. And in other forums, I've made recommendations on how our public school system, our religious organizations, our healthcare systems, our neighborhoods, our businesses, our workplaces have a responsibility to develop people to their full potential, which means at higher levels of stages. It's not just about learning math and English. It's about becoming a whole person. And if we make that investment, then it's going to be much easier to resolve relationships and conflicts and to heal down the road. So it must begin on that foundation. That's, again, why I have it at stage 0. And for you as a mediator or a counselor or a coach, be aware of the stages of consciousness of your clients and any adversaries or other parties involved, and don't take it personally. See it for what it is, and maybe you can be the one to generate the higher stage of consciousness and empathy, which will then radiate and provide an environment for these other people to perhaps for the first time to take some personal ownership for their truth and to absorb and listen to someone else's truth.
Wow. Thank you for that. You know, what you're saying about just really having a commitment as a society to higher consciousness, that's huge, isn't it?
Well, in organizations, because that's where most of my work has been, my lifetime, there's this very popular phrase that organizations embody in their vision or mission statements, and that is, people are our most important assets. Well, if that's the case, what are you doing to nurture and enhance the consciousness of your people? If the discussion remains, how do we motivate people? How do we get them to comply to rules and regulations? How can we get them to do more at work with less time? If that's where it remains, you will always have the same problem in human resources. But if you recognize that by having programs to expand consciousness, that's where your people will be creative, involved, engaged, and happy. Mm.
Really, supporting people in being their fullest, they're rising to their best potential. That's what you're saying, really calling them to that.
I think every profession, the legal profession, you know, the medical profession, the healthcare profession, if you would call it a religious profession, the family profession, mothers and fathers, it's all about nurturing people to become whole human beings. That is what distinguishes us from the animal kingdom. If there's one thing, because we've inherited all the brains, you know, the mammalian brain, the reptilian brain, we have the cerebral cortex that has the capacity for self-aware consciousness where we can ask, why are we here? What is my role? Where is this universe going? What is the history of things? What's the projection? Can I change that course? We don't have a sense that animals have those dialogues. We have that capacity. And so unless we nurture that, we are not living our lives at a much better place than our pets.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And then the other thing, what you commented on is that regarding the question about different people at different levels is that we as mediators can provide that higher consciousness.
Yes, I have certainly found that because I have been actively involved for the last 15, 20 years in particular with what I've termed mind, body, spirit consciousness and modalities for enhancing that. I could give a whole other forum on that topic. But I have certainly found that as I've gotten clearer about who I am, as I've gotten to feel the sensations in my body and recognize that there's wisdom there if I pay attention to it, because in our society we've generally been taught to numb our bodies, okay, and to use our minds. But most of the wisdom first comes to the body before it ever reaches the mind. And in terms of spirituality is to realize that there's a higher intelligence beyond myself. It's not just my ego. There is a consciousness out there, which is being supported, incidentally, by work in quantum physics. So this is not just about psychology or New Age thinking. This is supported by our highest standards of science. And as I've developed that, my engagement with clients has a different feel, a different tone. People open up more. I can set the environment. I can set the stage. I can hold the space for people to explore what they couldn't ordinarily explore. So again, that is the responsibility for mediators, for consultants, for coaches, for facilitators, is what are you doing so that you can create the space so others can heal.
Mm-hmm. So here's a follow-up question from the same person. When we are working with individuals, both and let's say they're both at a very low level of consciousness, what's the best small step to take? So that, and I think this is, again, a good question, because I know sometimes I'm up against this in a case right now too, actually, where somebody just can't see themselves, can't take responsibility. It's, they just really, they're the victim. What's a realistic expectation for?
Well, one thing that I have made use of, and you mentioned earlier about this Tki Conflict Model, I developed many years ago, but if you can picture this, there is the two dimensions. There is the distributive dimension, where it's a give and take, where it's a win-lose, I'm right, you're wrong, and we argue over that. And you can show where people are on this model and say, if you keep this posturing, what you're going to achieve is very small or not at all. And you kind of suggest what the consequences are for staying locked into that position. Then there's the other diagonal, which we call the integrative dimension, which moves up to collaborating and synthesizing. And what that does is it expands the size of the pie. It shows what a win-win is. So whether the mediation has to do with a divorce, children, a commercial financial settlement, it's saying if we can find a space, we can both get more than what we get by being locked in. And by placing things on a model and seeing the visual and say, well, what do you want? A very small piece? Are you arguing over the size of a very small pie? Or if we could expand the size of the pie, there's more for both of us. What do you want? This is your own self-interest. You can get more if you take a different position. That sometimes helps. It sometimes helps to give people assessments, whether it's my own assessment or other people's assessments, to give them a little self-awareness. This is how I tend to come across when I met with stress, when I met with conflict, when I met with differences, and this is another approach. It's sometimes enough to get people off the dime to see things. What's interesting is if we can just get people to do what's in their own selfish interest, they'd be better off than doing spite or fear or remaining at war, because nobody's benefiting from that. So if you can get them to see, hey, okay, be selfish, at least be rational about what you'll get by taking a different approach. And then, if we had more time, I'd also talk about when truth is important and when it's not important. There's sometimes an approach that says, who cares what the story was? It's all socially constructed anyway, based on selective memory, self-interest. Nobody knows what happened. Even if you videotaped it, you wouldn't find out what's going on inside people and what the intentions are. And you may be aware the research on eyewitnesses tells you that depending on your own race, your own experience, you're going to see the objective situation differently. And so much for eyewitness reports, because those are biased as well. So you put truth aside and you say, why don't we forget having to resolve the truth? And can we move forward and say, what will bring peace? What's going to make you happy? And if you're going to live in the past, you probably won't be happy. What it means to live happy in the future. And get off the point where you're stuck on saying until we agree on the truth, we can't move forward. But let's take a higher road, which is let's think about happiness. And in case of, for example, divorce mediation, which is just classic, is you also got to bring in the children and start saying, okay, but what's best for the children? What's going to be best for them to learn so they can pass it on to their children? Get it beyond the person to see that there are consequences for staying stuck as opposed to moving forward. But I must say, sometimes people are in so much pain, have so much anger, have so much hate, have so much unresolved from the past that they need to stay at war for the next 10 years. And there's nothing that you or I can do about it. We can't take it personally. It's just not their time. They're on a different path. And you can offer the possibility of expanding their horizons, but at some point you can say they're just not ready and they need to be in pain because pain is familiar. In fact, if you gave them peace, they wouldn't know what to do with it. They would create pain because that's all they know. And that again tells you that violations of boundaries from the past, starting in day one in childhood, if they're not resolved, they creep into the present And that's what you're really fighting about. You're not
Mm-hmm.
fighting about what happened last year. You're fighting about what is unresolved from 30 years ago.
What happened when you were 3.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. I love your clarity about that. That's very, very powerful.
Who's responsible for this? I put part of the responsibility on our society, and I have made recommendations that our public school systems, healthcare, religious organizations, communities have programs that are maybe 25% of the curriculum, if you will, that are about mind, body, spirit, consciousness. If you don't know who you are, if you're not at peace and feel good about yourself, what difference does it make to excel on English and math scores if you're an unhappy person and you stand ready to act out your violations on the people around you?
Yes, Ralph, I wish you had run for president. I want to put you in charge.
That issue has been settled.
Yes, I'm happy with the outcome, actually, but I'm just saying, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
I
have applied, just ironically or not, I have applied these models to our political system and the adversary relationship between the two major parties, and how they are at war with one another, and they're prepared to use spite and fear to drag the other party down so the other side gets reelected. It doesn't matter which side you're talking about.
That's right, the whole system.
What is transpartisan behavior, where we can expand the size of the pie and so that more people's needs get met and that people can do what they've been brought to office to do? This is all about conflict, boundaries, truth, unresolved relationships from the past, and the stages of consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Right. And having a populace that's at a high enough stage of consciousness to demand that.
Yeah. And again, once well, as I said, I've been at this for 40 years. I can't say I was aware of all what I'm saying 10, 20 years ago, but I have now seen how what we're talking about operates at every level of society, starting from the conflicts within you, and the different voices and how you struggle to make sense of every day, all the way to the wars that still go on between nations who are fighting over lines in the sand as if it was, life or death, even though it's the history, it's what's unresolved that happened 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago or more that has still not been addressed.
Right. Great. Well, again, if anybody has a question, star 2, please raise your hand, and you're welcome to jump in if you want to ask a question or make a comment. And do that. Please do that at any time while we're talking, and I'll keep my eye on the screen to see. I want to ask you something. Well, in the meantime, Ralph, which is, I've noticed that you use the word forgivingness.
Yes.
And I'm liking it, and I wanted to know what your meaning is and why you express it that way.
The way I've looked at it, and you've done much more work on that particular term than I have. It's just interesting, though, that I definitely felt that is an important stage in the process. And for me, I want to emphasize again that it has to do with the issue of judgment. And that it's one thing to say, I forgive you for what you did, or please forgive me for what I did, or I should forgive myself for what I did to you, or I should forgive myself what I did to myself. That's a separate issue than I judged myself. There's something fundamental about judging other people. In fact, in the whole realm of stages of consciousness, and becoming more aware that there's more out there besides your ego, which we call spirituality in an interesting way. What we discover is that as you evolve, you recognize that there is no place for judging yourself and other people. And if somebody has claimed that they have evolved to a higher stage of consciousness, and they're out there judging other people as being good or bad, right or wrong, as opposed to saying, they're on a path. I want to nurture them. I want to facilitate them. Their time will come. I won't resent them. They are what they are. I have to accept them. I have to love them. I have to have empathy with them. As the Dalai Lama has said, sometimes he has been challenged. The question is, can he remain fully compassionate of those who imprison his people, the Chinese or whomever? Can you have compassion for your quote-unquote worst enemy? That is being a spiritual person, and being able to feel that also about yourself. So forgiveness is so much about what stage of consciousness you're at. At the lowest stages of consciousness, it's simply saying, I'm sorry, sometimes without meaning it. I'm sorry I hurt you, without knowing what the I and the you is, because if I'm egocentric, it's all I. There is no you. You're just an object. So what does it mean to say, I'm sorry for having hurt you? That's at one stage of consciousness. At higher stages of consciousness, the whole notion of events evaporates, and it's a question about, can I love and embrace everything, everybody, every being, the entire planet, the entire universe. It's not about judging anything. And when you take the judgment feature away, there's such a sigh of relief. That's where peace begins. Incidentally, let me emphasize something. Peace is something that most people haven't experienced. They don't know what to do with. They just know struggle. And sometimes when they have the opportunity for peace, they'll purposely self-destruct to make sure they're still at war with someone or themselves. Incidentally, there's maybe this would be a good time. There's one other model that I have found exceedingly useful, and I go back to that question about how do you show two people at the lower stages of consciousness that it's possible to move beyond their battle. And it's a work done by Kubler-Ross. I think her first name is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, a book back in the 1960s called On Death and Dying. And she had a 5-stage model. We're always doing models. We love models. A 5-stage model on the grieving process. And I have expanded that in my work to 7 stages and brought it into everyday experience, not just when someone's dying or grieving a loss of somebody's passing. And stage 1 is loss. Okay, so you lose someone, or you lose something, or you lose the relationship, or you lose your financial status, or whatever you lose, okay, you've lost something. The next stage, stage 2, is shock, especially when that loss is something that your ego has been deeply attached to. You need that to do well, to survive, to feel good about yourself, and you've lost it. So then you go into shock. This is a physiological reaction, and perhaps we know clients who are losing sleep. They can't concentrate. They have headaches. They get illness. These are all physiological responses. The body's screaming because the whole world got disrupted. The rug was pulled out from under you. The next stage is denial. We've all heard about denial, and that's basically saying it didn't happen. I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning, and this will all go away. I didn't do this. I didn't do that. Just total denial because you feel your world is so threatened. The next stage, stage 4, is anger. It's not fair. You can't do this to me. This shouldn't have happened. How dare you? I resent you for what you did. Now, those first 4 stages I call the doom cycle, because people can be stuck in that doom cycle for how long? Decades, their whole lives. We sometimes call that depression. And events take place. People break up a relationship. People lose a financial settlement or whatever the case might be, and they remain angry. They remain in denial. They remain in shock. It affects their body. They get sick. The next stage, stage 5, and that's where things really begin to change, is sadness. And sadness is, for the first time, you are feeling what you lost. You're feeling the sensations in your body. You're allowing it in. That is so important. Until you feel what you've lost, you will go through the doom cycle year after year, decade after decade. And after sadness, really feeling it, and there may be a lot of crying, there may be pain, but my goodness, you're finally getting in touch with reality because that loss did take place. And for the first time, you're letting it in. Stage 6 is acceptance. This is when you're saying, basically, it did happen. This is part of my life. This is what I have to deal with. And then stage 7 is adaptiveness, where you start moving forward in life, moving on. What I described in the other model as stage 8. Now, somewhere in those last few stages would be forgiveness of yourself and of the others involved, and the all-important forgiving for having judged yourself and having judged someone else as a human being that is less than you or should have known better, whatever. And of course, it's only a matter of time in our crazy world when there's going to be another loss and you go through the cycle again. Mm-hmm. Resiliency is how you can go through these cycles productively, effectively, not overnight, because that's not real. You're not being human. Certain losses take grief. It takes time. It takes a mourning period. But it tells you that resilience is recognizing that in today's world, you're going to be losing things. I remember one person wrote a book, Judith Boyd, on necessary losses. It's part of growing up. You're going to lose things. You're going to lose your innocence. You're going to lose certain things. But can you get past that? Can you be resilient? So in terms of clients, I have shown clients who are stuck in the doom cycle this model and ask them, where are you? Tell me your experiences in each of these stages. And often they realize that there's more to life than remaining in shock, in denial, and angry all the time. And then they also acknowledge their migraine headaches, their stomach pains, cancer, tumors, you name it. Illness comes, and this is another discussion we can have, but all kinds of disease and illness, it all comes from not living your life, period. You're not living your life, and your body is screaming out, and it's going to tell you. And the basic message your body will give you, year after year of not living your life, it says, if you're not going to live what you're here to live, we are going to decompose your cells and give them to someone else who has another shot at continuing the progression of consciousness in the universe. I think that's the whole disease model.
Whoa. So your body's saying you must, so it's, the message is you must live what you are here to live.
Yeah. Otherwise, you're going to get various signals. They may start with headaches or stomach aches. They'll get more serious, trying to get your attention, saying, you have a purpose. Everybody has a purpose here. And the question is, you have to figure it out, you have to discover it, and then you have to live it. And that's what happiness is, that's what health is, that's what wellness is. Once the healthcare community fully embraces this, it will change everything. But then we have to deal with organizational change, which is a whole other topic.
Right.
But it's good, I think, to understand at a fundamental level what's going on, so you don't take it personally, you don't judge yourself, you don't judge other people, and maybe you give a model to two people and say, where are you on this? Can you see that there's something bigger? Even if you were self-interested and only thought about yourself, what is in your best interest to do? And most people tell you it's in their self-interest to stay healthy, to stay well, and not to inflict disease upon themselves, and therefore to move past the doom cycle. That's very selfish, but it already serves a purpose. And they're more likely to resolve something if they say, yeah, it's better for me to be well than to be struck with a disease.
I have a question for you, Ralph. So you said something right before you got into these cycles, which is fascinating, that was also felt very important. And you mentioned this a couple of times, that you said even when people sort of are approaching peace, that they may sabotage it, something to go back into their pain. What is that about?
Well, the word family has the same root as what is familiar. And a story I use is, and it's kind of a joke, but it has a point. And I think I actually made this up, unless someone said it before me, I don't know. But there was a study done and found that 90% of all families of origin are dysfunctional. And they've never been able to find the other 10%. Welcome to the human race. We struggle. That is the nature. We struggle already trying to get through the birth canal. That's the first trauma, is the birth trauma. And this has been written about by Otto Rank and others, that this is the first struggle in life, is getting through the canal and surviving. And it doesn't end there. It just sort of continues. And so to appreciate a spiritual path is to recognize that we are not just our animal selves. We can be self-aware, and we can also be aware that we are more than just our egos, what we're encapsulated. We can be a connection of consciousness in the universe. And as that unfolds, that awareness, everything else changes. And as a result, we then have the capacity to be much more than ourselves. That is, I think, the core of everything.
Yeah.
And if you can show someone a model, if you can bring that insight to people, it sometimes awakens them, if they're ready. If they're not ready, they have to be in battle. But the point of peace is, how many people know what an experience of joy, peace, and compassion are like? Did you feel it in your childhood? When? Growing up? Most people have a hard time responding to that. Again, I might say, happiness depends on what stage of consciousness you're at. Peace, what stage of consciousness? Mm-hmm. At the lower stages of consciousness, happiness and peace are just like nobody bothering you. Mm-hmm. At the higher stages of consciousness, it is this eternal, loving bliss that permeates you and every dialogue and every interaction you have. In fact, I would say this. One of the important lessons for me is, no matter what the situation, look upon it in terms of what stage of consciousness are people in, because that will tell you what words like truth, peace, joy, conflict mean to them. And that will give you a better idea of what to expect. There won't be any surprises, and then perhaps you can be at peace with yourself because you can say, I can put these seeds out there for people to look at something larger than themselves, to resolve the situation so they can get on with their healing and with their life. But if they don't take it after I've done all I can to permeate and radiate an energy of love and peace, well, it's not their time. I move on to something else. I don't judge myself. I don't judge them. Mm-hmm. There's no resentment. I'll continue my own peace. I'll continue my own journey.
Right.
And if we all do that,
Beautiful.
The world will evolve the way it was intended.
Brilliant. Yes. Another good question here is, do you have any resources available that speak of the material that you've been covering in the call? And when will your book be out?
Okay. Well,
this person also asked about contacting, and we can. That would probably be just a matter of saying your website, but let's give that too.
Well, I was at the University of Pittsburgh for 30 years, published many articles and books. Starting in 2009, I began creating, thanks to the Internet and to e-learning technology, I started creating online recorded courses that are on conflict management, change management, with consciousness woven throughout. And so I'm trying to use the new technology, we call it e-learning, to bring this to a much larger audience. And I'm really proud and with joy to say that people are making use of our courses from all over the world. They're in English, but English, at least in many of the large companies, is still the business language, so that works well. I purposely speak very slowly on these recordings because I'm talking to people who English may not be their first language. And there will be a course soon to come out. It will be, hopefully by the end of next year, is on bringing mind, body, spirit, consciousness to your everyday life, to organizations. That is touched upon throughout the courses, but I'm going to have a course to focus on it. We now have 6 online courses, including like quantum transformation, conflict management, culture management, team management. Everything that I found important, I have put into those courses. And I think and I see that people are more receptive. If I had talked about consciousness 10, 20 years ago and mind, body, spirit, people would roll their eyes. I tried. In the 1990s, I gave a talk to an accounting firm on bringing consciousness in, and I almost lost them until I asked them, wait a minute, just let's stop the discussion. Are you happy? What do you want out of life? And then the discussion came alive. People have a hunger to have meaning, but often organizations discourage people from bringing their whole selves to the workplace. We've got to change that. And then I also have a book called Quantum Transformation, or Quantum Organizations, that also talks about explicitly that consciousness is the core of every organization, starting from family to the United Nations, and I suggest how you can bring consciousness into organizations. So this has become my theme in life, and I'll be glad to get any emails, any questions, anything about this, because this is what I do. This is my soul's purpose. If I don't do this, I get sick.
That's great. So, and the website is what?
Website is
want to give that?
Kilmann. That's Kilmann. Diagnostics, plural, one word. KilmanDiagnostics.com. And there are many articles. There's about my book, Quantum Organizations, about our 6 online courses, about the TKI. I have other assessments. And it's my life's work, and it's a joy to see this Internet thing happening, where people can take these courses on a smartphone, on an Internet tablet. Who knew? There's a revolution going on in how do you bring knowledge to people, and I hope universities are recognizing that they're not going to always be getting students sitting in classrooms with teachers. There's a revolution.
Well, and I wanted to say you also have an excellent blog there. I was reading some of the pieces that you've read, and they're great.
A lot of those blogs are about bringing consciousness into organizations, about the ego, the self, the personal transformations involved. I have been seeding this for years, but in the past I had to be, as I said, you have to be careful what words you use. You use the word spirituality and people think you're arguing religion, and that's not it at all, and so on and so forth. But I'm just thrilled that there is a greater acceptance of people are willing to examine this. I'm glad I'm still around so I can enjoy it.
I just want to thank you for putting it all out on the table, because you could, it's not just the normal, consulting, corporate, whatever models. I mean, you have that, but that you take it all the way through to higher consciousness, spirituality, and really connect that. I feel that is just so important, and thank you for doing that. It's real, walking your talk, obviously, but it's just so refreshing. It feels so good when you bring that forward. So thank you for that piece.
Thank you. It was a joy.
Yeah. So obviously I'm a big fan. I just think very highly of all of this, and I hope you just continue to enlighten us, because this is just so important in terms of how we learn how to deal with conflict and bring more consciousness to it. So thank you, Ralph. And I really do encourage people who are on the call or listening to the replay to look at the website and look at all the great materials on the site and the courses and all of that. It's very rich. And so I guess this is a good time to start wrapping up. And thank you for those of you who are here. The only announcement I want to give today is that I am launching some programs now. Everybody